We're now going to spend some time reflecting on the significance of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Throughout history, Christians have made an extraordinary claim that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. Jesus died on the Friday, and 3 days later, when women went to his tomb in order to attend to his body with herbs and spices, they found the tomb empty, and they heard that Jesus was not there, that Jesus had been raised from the dead and was going to go ahead of his disciples and meet them in Galilee. Now, it's important firstly to understand what we mean by this term resurrection. In fact, when we read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, there are 3 different incidents that involve people being raised from the dead. There are 3 instances in the gospels when Jesus brings someone back to life who was previously dead. And it's important to realize that these incidents are not incidences of resurrection, that these incidents speak of resuscitation. Because in each of these 3 cases, Jesus is bringing someone back to the same kind of life that they had before. They're coming back from death. When we talk about resurrection, we're talking about something quite different happening. We're talking about Jesus entering into death and coming out the other side into a different kind of life, a different kind of embodied existence. And so the resurrection is unique. Christians believe that Jesus is the only person in history ever to have been resurrected. There is nothing else quite like what Christians claim happened to Jesus on that first Easter Sunday morning. Now, Mark himself is very, very brief in his account of how the women found the empty tomb. He doesn't give us many insights into why the resurrection of Jesus is so important. For those insights, it's more helpful to go to other places in the New Testament, and in particular the letters that were written by Paul and others. And they reflect on that first Easter Sunday and give us a clear understanding of why, in their view, belief in the resurrection is fundamental to Christian belief. One of the most important places that Paul writes about the resurrection is his first letter to the Corinthians. The Corinthians were Christians living in Corinth, in modern-day Greece, and we have 2 of Paul's letters that he wrote to the Christians living there. In the first of those letters, and in chapter 15, Paul has this extended piece of writing about the fundamental significance of belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, in effect, if you claim to be a Christian, but you don't believe that Jesus was literally, physically raised from the dead, then you're confused. You can't be a Christian. Properly understood, you cannot be a Christian and not accept the resurrection. And then he proceeds to explain why. Here's one of the things he says there in that chapter. He says, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, your faith is futile, it's meaningless, because you are still in your sins. Now, what Paul is saying there is that there's a link between Jesus' death on the cross and Jesus' resurrection. And it's important that we understand that connection between the 2 events. We can think of it this way. The Romans crucified many, many people, perhaps thousands, tens of thousands of people. What entitles any Christian to say that the death of Jesus, crucifixion of Jesus, was any different, was any more significant than the death of anybody else that was crucified by the Roman Empire? What is it that entitles a Christian to say it's Jesus' crucifixion that is significant, and it's in a completely different category to the crucifixion of everyone else? Paul's answer to that question is that Jesus, and Jesus alone, was raised from the dead. That shows that when Jesus died on the cross, There was something special, there was something unusual, there was something significant about that death. And Paul would want us to understand the logic this way. When Jesus died on the cross, it seemed to his followers as if it were the end. But in the event, they were proved to be wrong. 3 days later, Jesus was raised from the dead. What does that tell us about the cross? It tells us that when Jesus died on the cross, he won a decisive victory over death. Death could not hold him. And in Paul's mind, there is this connection between sin and death. In fact, it's a connection that runs all the way through the Bible, all the way from Genesis chapter 3 onwards. You cannot separate sin and death. Death is the consequence of sin. Sin leads to death. So if Jesus won a decisive victory over death when he died on the cross, he was also winning a decisive victory over sin. So the resurrection is the demonstration that when Jesus died on the cross, he accomplished something of momentous significance. He won a decisive victory over death, and that means he won a decisive victory over sin. And if Jesus won a decisive victory over sin, it means that Christians can be assured, they can have confidence that their sins are forgiven. So for Paul, the cross and the resurrection go together. You cannot separate the two. The only justification that any Christian has for saying that the cross is significant for their faith is because the resurrection happened as an event in history. It's the first thing Paul says. Then Paul goes on later in that chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, to say that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now, when Paul uses the language of falling asleep, he's referring to those who have died. He says Jesus has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. Now, first fruits was a concept that would have been very familiar to most of Paul's original audience. The first fruits for the Jewish people were simply the first fruits, the first part of the harvest to be gathered in. And when the Jews collected in the first part of the harvest, they had a great celebration. It was called the Feast of Weeks. And one of the reasons why the first fruits were such a big deal was because the Jewish people took the first fruits as God's guarantee to them that the greater harvest was still to come. They had the first fruits in hand. That was God's guarantee to them. It was God's pledge to them that there was a harvest, a greater harvest out there in the fields, which in the fullness of time would be gathered in as well. Now, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. And he's saying this, that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is God's pledge, God's guarantee that one day all those who belong to Christ will also be raised. And it's for this reason that Christians have a hope for life after death. The resurrection of Jesus gives them that hope. They believe that the resurrection of Jesus is God's guarantee to each one of them that one day they will be raised from the dead just as Christ has been raised from the dead. Death will not have the final say. Death is not the end. There is a hope that goes beyond the grave. The third thing that Paul says in that great chapter about the resurrection is that the resurrection says something about who Jesus is. It tells us something about his identity. The resurrection shows that Jesus is in a different category to every other human being who's ever lived. Jesus is truly unique. He's the only person ever to have been raised from the dead, the only person to have gone into death and out the other side into a different kind of embodied existence. So the resurrection puts Jesus in a different category. It shows us that Jesus is no mere religious teacher, not just a great example of how to live a good, moral, God-honouring life. He's not just a prophet. That Jesus is different from anyone else that we might categorise in those kinds of ways. Jesus was and is the Son of God, says Paul. And he's demonstrated to be the Son of God through his resurrection from the dead. In fact, another of his letters, in his letter to the Romans, Paul talks of the resurrection being the declaration that Jesus is the Son of God. he is the Christ, the long-awaited Messiah. So those three things, those three concepts that we find in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian believers, gives us some insight into why the resurrection continues to be of fundamental importance to Christians today. We've got the idea that Jesus' resurrection from the dead gives Christians that assurance that their sins were dealt with when Jesus died on the cross, and so they can be confident that their sins have been forgiven. Secondly, the resurrection of Jesus gives Christians confidence that there is a hope for a life beyond the grave. There is that guarantee of a life after death. And thirdly, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead shows him to be no mere man, no mere prophet, no mere religious teacher. He was and is the Son of God himself,